Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Rise News. I am Adesua Omorwan.
And I'm Rufai. You're sitting beautiful pink you've got on this morning.
Thank you, Rufai. Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is one of the key priorities of Africa's Agenda 2063 and a flagship project for the continent. So far, signed by 54 countries and ratified by 26 countries on the continent.
Nigeria have finally signed the AFCTA. In fact, we did that over the weekend in Niger. We'll finally join the growing number of African countries positioned to take the continent to the next level.
Indeed. And Dr. Andrew Nevin, partner and chief economist of PwC, will be joining us to take a look at the economic importance of this agreement.
But before he joins us, let's take a look at this African Union report on the African Continental Free Trade Area. Stay with us, we'll be right back.
We are calling on everybody to think Africa, act Africa, and prosper Africa.
It comes down to the change of mindset.
I think this is an opportunity which Africa should not miss.
We are implementing the Africa we want.
A lot of the countries understand that this is good for them, that it is a game changer.
This is an historic moment for our continent.
So this is entirely African-driven. These African countries are making a treaty among themselves.
We've been brought up with so many borders. You know, we have our little countries, we have our little economies, our little sectors. We have so many things that divide us, and I think this is an opportunity to really push against those boundaries and to change them.
As the old adage goes, there is strength in unity. For the 55 African Union member states, that strength lies in numbers. With a population of 1.2 billion and a GDP of $2.5 trillion, the prospect and now realization of a continental free trade area for Africa promises to usher in a new era of industrialization and business opportunities towards the realization of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want.
It has been a long journey, difficult and long, but we had visionaries. When we created the Organization of African Unit in 1963, President Nkrumah of Ghana made a clarion call: Africa must unite. In June 2015, the heads of state and government had an assembly in Johannesburg, and they adopted the principles for negotiations, the roadmap, as well as the institutions. And we had several rounds of negotiations. Then the regional communities came in to give technical inputs with other strategic key partners, namely the African Development Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And the initial good results were established in December 2017. Then in January, we gave the report to the heads of state and government, and they were very impressed. They say the remaining work can be done in a short time. So let's have a signing ceremony on 21st March 2018 in Kigali. And we were able to produce the consolidated text that was signed today. It's composed of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area and the protocol on trade in goods. the protocol on trade in services, and the protocol on the settlement of disputes. And this is where we are.
The African Continental Free Trade Area will affect the development of African countries by boosting employment opportunities, increasing food security, increasing competitiveness of African industrial products, and enhancing participation of the continent in global trade.
For us, the African Continental Free Trade Area, of course, it's a flagship project of Agenda 2063, but more than that, it's an instrument for solidarity, and it's an instrument for connection between African people and and basically dismantling the borders and the barriers that are there, because there are great opportunities for goods to move more efficiently, for services, as well as people. So I think that for us, it's a very important lever for achieving multiple objectives.
Well, what got us here is increasing realization that everywhere neighbors trade with neighbors. This is normal. What has been an anomaly for this continent is that since the 15th century, our trade has been directed primarily outside the continent. And that has to do with the way that Africa was inserted into the global economy. So this is what we are trying to reverse. So everything, our infrastructure has been built to support taking commodities from the interior to the ports and out to the north. So everything concerning trade has been organized around that external trade.
The CFTA negotiations have been complex, needing to take into consideration the individual interests of member states.
Yes, and indeed, Dr. Nevin is in the studios with us now. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Eritrea is the only holdout here, 54 out of 55 countries. Finally, Nigeria penned that signature with President Muhammadu Buhari's signature on the agreement. Is the AFCTA ready to go?
Well, I think, I mean, you saw in the segment, I mean, this is part of the 2063 project, so 2013 to 2063. So I think people should view this as a very long-term thing. I mean, it's a hugely positive step. It's amazing the progress that's been made so far, but it is a long-term project. It's not going to fix any of the problems that we all know in Nigeria, for example. We still need to fix those. But ultimately, it's fantastic. I mean, this new Pan-Africanism, I mean, one of the things that they didn't say in the report, but the population of Africa will be over 2 billion in 2050. It'll be the largest pole of population. It needs to be connected. It needs to trade with itself to be prosperous. So I think it's fantastic news. We were all very happy to see Nigeria sign up for it finally, and I'm sure Eritrea will have to come into the fold.
Let's just go down to the nitty-gritty now, Andrew. A lot of people are saying, yeah, better late than never for Nigeria. But there are bordering issues. Take, for instance, there was the issue of the protocol of trade. If you read that document properly, the protocol of trade is still pretty much hinged on GATT. How do you make it specific for Nigeria? That document doesn't have a robust appeal on settlement of disputes. There's still a drudgery of time. In fact, there's a 60-day window before you can set up a dispute settlement body and a panel. And we all know what is happening as we speak today in Africa. I mean, you want to talk us through the dynamic. Let's talk about the technicality of this.
Well, to begin with, I mean, I think the federal government here should only be spending 2% of its economic time thinking about the AFCFTA. As I said, this is decades it's going to take to unfold. So nothing is going to surprise us. I mean, one of the things that the AFCFTA says quite clearly is we're going to start by strengthening the regional economic organization. So in our part of Africa, this means strengthening ECOWAS, making ECOWAS work better, and step-by-step integrating those, step-by-step having a common external viewpoint. But I wouldn't be worried about these details. What I'd be more concerned about in Nigeria's case, and we talked about readiness of Nigeria, for example, is getting ready for this, right? And forcing us, I mean, we all knew we needed to do it here. Nigeria knows it needs to do it, but forcing Nigeria to do the structural changes so it can be competitive. So that obviously means power, infrastructure. So the one thing I want to make sure is people aren't distracted from all the structural issues we need to address by the fact we've signed up for AFCFTA.
You talked about power and some other things. But a lot of people are saying, will Nigeria ever get it right? Because all of this you've talked about, industrialization. There used to be a plan called the first industrial plan in Nigeria, the second industrial plan of the 70s where Nigeria was supposed to go. All of this you're talking about, if we had gotten the second industrial plan, right, which was started, which led to, the starting of Ajaokuta steel plants and some other steel heavy industry companies like that, we will not be talking about it today. But today, all those places, all those companies are moribund. I was in New York over the weekend. I tried going to Okada Abasi, where Alscon was, the biggest, ceramic production factory. Everything's all shut down. So will Nigeria ever be ready for this?
Well, I only have a 10-year history here. So what I've seen in the 10 years that I've been here is back in the period when we had high oil prices, no one cared about these issues. And Nigeria squandered all the money. I mean, all of the money, excess oil revenue was either consumed or effectively diverted, and we know that. Then we entered the period 2014 till now where the oil price declined. And I think we were in denial for a number of years in Nigeria about what was going on. The difference I feel in my 10 years is at least we're acknowledging the problems. So the federal government's come out and said, yes, we have 100 million people in poverty. What are we going to do about it? They're committed to do something about it. The CBN has just come out, a new mandate with the governor, and said, actually, we need double-digit economic growth, not 2%. And so that acknowledgement, at least, I think, is a critical sign. Now, in terms of execution, yeah, we can all point to so many projects that have not been executed well. I mean, we have said, I think at PwC quite consistently for 3 years, a lot of what has to happen at the subnational and the state level. And what you're seeing, I think, is in some places, Governor Obaseki, certainly Lagos State, Governor Sanwo-Olu, and of course Governor Ambode. You see Governor of Ogun State, Ogun under Adeosun made lots of progress. I think it'll make progress, the new government. I was in Oyo the other day, Governor Makinda is committed. So you see governors now stepping up, and I think that's going to be a catalyst for change. And I think it's harder to have failed projects when they're financed and they're driven at the state level.
Well, this is like the rising tide that's supposed to lift all the boats, but there are fears that, Nigeria may just be sinking. But let me ask you, where's the competitive advantage for Nigeria? Where do you think that Nigeria can have that advantage, apart from oil and cement?
Well, I think that to begin with, we actually should be a financial center. So, I mean, one of the things, I was at a conference recently where people were saying, actually, we should have one capital market for Africa. Now, I don't know if we'll get there, but if you think about, we have the Nigerian Stock Exchange, Cote d'Ivoire, et cetera. But we've already got a great financial center here, right? And of course, the banks in Nigeria have done very well in Ghana, for example, and we've got banks like UBA, which has a big African footprint. EcoBank, you might say, is not a Nigerian bank, but 40% of its footprint is in Nigeria, and it is the Pan-African bank. So I think financial services is one area. But then in the heartland, I mean, once we fix power, when you have that kind of population density, a lot of things are going to be manufactured. I was with some people yesterday from Abba State, and we were talking about the historical manufacturing in Abba State. I mean, power is going to bring these things back quickly. So, I mean, we still have this issue. We're uncompetitive, right? But we all know that now. But having low-cost power, particularly gas to power, is such a huge competitive advantage. But I think the pressure is on to turn this around.
So this is a wake-up call for Nigeria when it comes to power. But technically, I think we have about 2 years for the implementation to start. Do you think that Nigeria can wake up to that call of fixing power, for instance?
Well, I mean, we've also advocated, again, big theme that PwC has put down is issues solved at the local level. I think there's more and more discussion. If you think about power, so for example, renewable energy. I mean, Lagos is now the leading place on the planet for innovation around small-scale solar. Now, that's not necessarily going to power a factory, but certainly for the individual, it's made a big difference. We have so many projects going on, small-scale solar. I think you're going to see similar projects, innovation around waste to energy. So we've said, look, I think power is going to be more solvable at the local or kind of more regional level. And I think people are starting to come to that realization. I mean, the power decentralization.
We'll talk more about that realization. Sorry to cut you short, Dr. Nevin. We'll go for a short break now, and we'll be right back to discuss some more.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We've got Dr. Andrew S. Nevin. I mean, Andrew, I've been meaning to ask you the meaning of S in your name. Partner, chief economist at PwC. And we're still talking about Nigeria in general and the AFCTA, and we're talking about preparedness. So I just was talking in the lines of, we've not created power all this while. it cannot happen overnight. I mean, when it comes to very good plans, we have a lot of good plans on paper in this country. I was talking about the first industrial plan, the second industrial plan, the third industrial plan. I mean, if everything was followed to the letter, you will see the change in this country. But what you've not been able to do in the first power plant went out in Nigeria in 1922, 23. What you've not been able to achieve, and there was never a time Nigeria had sustainable self-power. Let's not deceive ourselves. What you've not been able to achieve since 1923, how can you achieve it in 2 years to support manufacturing? It's almost impossible.
Well, I mean, you're right. You're not going to power the whole country in 2 years. But remember, 2 years is when the AFCTA begins. So again, it's just a long-term process. But I think that, I mean, people can figure out power here. I mean, you and I have talked many times, Rufai, about the fact private actors can sort things out in Nigeria. Like the cement manufacturers, they figured out how to supply power so they can be competitive and produce cement. There are lots of projects going on with the private sector thinking about how they can create power. I don't have any doubt, certainly where in the gas-producing regions, they can produce power close to where the gas is and power industrial activity. But I think it's happening. But as I said,
there's still a lot of dogma on the grid. It's not the same.
But
I mean,
I think in a way,
if you read the Power Act of 2005, that famous document, the former Power Minister Fashola keeps talking about, he still talks about how undemocratic the national grid is.
Right, but
there's no flexibility on the grid.
But I think what happens is, again, in this case, we always think about kind of the official national level what's going on, and of course we talk about the collapse of the grid, and we talk about there only being 4,000 megawatts at best, et cetera. But that's not the reality. There's lots of power being produced by private actors in this much larger amount that's being produced that would ultimately go through the grid. And I think that work that's going on sort of underneath the radar is what's going to drive it, and eventually, hopefully, the policy will catch up that will support that.
Is that why we spend, well over $1 billion in generators and diesel? Because that's when you say private actors, you're talking diesel generation, you're talking inefficient fossil fuel.
Right now, a lot of that is that way. But as I said, where solar is starting to come in, waste to energy is starting to come in. The thing about gas we have a view of these big grids, but the gas to electricity technologies change so much. You can do it at a smaller scale. You don't necessarily have to create such a large plant. So all of these underlying economic forces are going on while we kind of still talk at this national level. But I think ultimately power will be solved at the local level.
I know you don't want to talk about obstacles and you want to see the brighter picture here. You're optimistic about this, but we kind of shy away from these obstacles. Apart from power, we have decrepit infrastructure. Some would say perhaps the tariffs is another bottleneck, the barrier. But there's also the lengthy wait at the ports, for instance, in Nigeria, Apapa Gridlock. How much of an importance are these obstacles for Nigeria?
Well, we know they're huge, right? And at least at Apapa, the federal government has come out and said it's going to solve the problem. I'm not quite sure why this was not said, at the beginning of this administration 4 years ago. I mean, I think the thing is that we tend to have. I mean, if you look at some of the Western countries that are admired for their level of economic development, I mean, it essentially took from after the fall of Rome till the end of the 20th century to get there. So 1,600 years, and they went through huge wars, feudalism.
But Japan changed the balance of deficit in less than 150 years.
Right, but we're going to change
but
it.
Japan did it in less than that.
Right, no, but Nigeria is going to do it I mean, it's been a short period of time since the return to democracy, only 20 years. And as I said, I've been here for 10 of those years. I've seen progress. It's easy to get discouraged, but I mean, if you look at another economic model, which I think is closest for Africa or Nigeria, is India, right? So India, after the Second World War, it got its independence in 1947. It had many of the same issues: corruption, inefficiency, tribal, religious. When they split, there was effectively a civil war till they split to Pakistan. But in the 90s, they switched on. Now, one of the things that is interesting to me is what really started to drive them was this outsourcing boom. Because if you think of it, it's a similarity. So they could not, today they manufacture. The 90s, they could not manufacture. They had inefficient infrastructure, inefficient ports. So they weren't going to manufacture and export. But they could start to export their people's talents through the nascent internet at the time. And they millions of jobs. Now, I was with one of Nigeria's most fantastic entrepreneurs, Amal Hassan, from the north, who's created her company, Outsource Global, which has almost 1,000 seats now. She's exporting Nigerians' brains to the UK, to the United States, and she says incredible potential. So I actually think that's one of the areas we can work on now, because it doesn't require, if we're going to, we always talk about export, but to be honest, anything we create, even if we create it at a global price, if it goes through OPAPA, it's not going to be competitive. But we can export Nigerians' brains without that. Now, of course, we've talked a lot in PwC Nigeria. We put it on the agenda, this incredible diaspora remittance. So in that case, we physically send the people out, and then we get, but we lose their talent in the country, right? And it's a shame. And I have so many people who talk to me about Canada. But Amal Hassan is exporting Nigerian brains, but keeping the people in Nigeria.
In all fairness, I mean, there was a report recently released that says Nigerian Americans are one of the most successful diaspora groups in America, and they're doing quite well. But I also want to probe in the lines of infrastructure, Andrew. Only recently, I think it was the African Development Bank coming out to say that they wanted to build a $5 billion superhighway between Nigeria to Abidjan. Another thing that you need for trade is access. You need roads, you need infrastructure, but it's not there. I can take a train from Kano and I say I want to go to Mombasa. It should be possible if Africa wants to be linked and do trade. So even when AFCTA finally starts to get products in, still pretty much pops on the price. And I also want to allay the fears of a lot of people, because one factor people have been arguing on all this while is the fact that a very viable form of government revenue will be reduced when AFCTA comes in, and that's the customs revenue. Because, dropping of tariff and things like that would definitely cut all the other inroads for revenue customs normally have. So you want to talk us through that and talk us the problem of infrastructure?
Well, with respect to infrastructure in Nigeria, I think that what we all need to understand is the government has almost no resources. And I guess our view at PwC is the only thing the government should pay for is a road, because it's quite inefficient to have toll roads. So almost all roads should just be open roads. But the government has really no resources for building airports, for building seaports, for building rail terminals, et cetera. So all of that capital has to come from the outside, and I think we should admit that. With respect to the Lagos-Abidjan corridor, I mean, this project has been, the concept has been going on for a while. I mean, we haven't made enough progress on it. It's still quite difficult. But, I mean, Abidjan, Accra has improved. The border crossing between Ivory Coast and Ghana is significantly better. And hopefully that's a model that pushes the other bordering crossings to become more viable.
The issue of tariff and the ports,
right, so,
losing revenue from that.
I get that.
I think we made well over 2 billion naira. At the port,
right,
at the immigrations and things like that.
I think losing sight of where we're trying to go. I mean, the economy needs to be, in 10 years, 3-4 times bigger? The tax take needs to go from 6% to 15%. So the total tax take's going up 10 times. So this is a very small item. The only reason it seems large to us right now, relative to what we take, is because we take in so little, right? So let's keep our eye on how do we make the governor came out, CBN governor, and said we're going to grow 10%. Well, we grow 10% for 7 years, the economy doubles. We do it for 15 years, the economy is 4 times bigger. Our tax take as a percentage of GDP goes up massively. So we should be getting a lot more tax revenue. And using the tariff system as a big source of tax revenue, but that creates distortions, is not helpful to us. So let's keep our eye on the bigger picture.
So let's lose revenue as regards immigration collections, right, as regards...
Right, as I said, I think that's less relevant to us. Really, in terms of the tax system, the question is, how do we bring people into the formal system? So 65% of the Nigerian economy is informal, and people make a choice, right? So they're in the informal economy for a reason. So if we want to tax them, we need to bring them into the formal economy. But to bring them into the formal economy, we can't force people. They've already got an existing way of doing things. And even international trade, I think over 50% of ECOWAS trade is informal, right? I mean, there's lots of things happening at the borders here that are not captured by official statistics. But we can't force people into the formal system. We have to make it advantageous for them.
Indeed. This is beyond intra-Africa trade. It's also how the world will trade with Africa. This is the largest bloc since after the WTO. What are the implications for the FDIs for Nigeria? We saw the latest figures released by the NBS. FDIs, contributing a meager 2.8% to the total capital imports that we had for first quarter 2019. What are the implications of this agreement for Nigeria's FDIs?
Well, I think that to begin with, one of the critical things is people talk about dumping products into Africa through this. I mean, Africa has to have, will have, when this gets worked out, a united front. I mean, Europe has a united front and negotiates as a bloc to how it trades with the U.S., how it trades with India, how it trades with China. So Africa, under the AFCFTA, will have to negotiate as a bloc, so how it deals with each of the other economies. Now, of course, people have rightly said, look, dumping and rules of origin are critical. I mean, this won't work unless we have better visibility on the supply chain. And hopefully we don't have rogue countries, I won't name any, that facilitate breaking the rules. So if something comes from the EU, we have a common tariff across Africa, so the tariff has to be paid where it enters on that. But with respect to the FDI, I mean, remember, we're going to over 2 billion people. The Chinese population is shrinking. I mean, the working age population is already shrinking. The Indian population is stabilizing. We're going to be bigger than both India, well, much bigger than China, 3-4 times the size of Europe. We're going to be the big market. So when people who, for example, fast-moving consumer goods, so companies like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, where are they going to set up their manufacturing? I would think they would set it up in Nigeria.
All right, Andrew, we'll go for a quick break. We'll come back to you, but before we go for the quick break, you talked about countries and possibilities. I'm talking Morocco, and I'll give the instance about Morocco.
Countries going rogue?
Yeah,
you mean?
Morocco has got an initial trade deal with the EU. All right, it's got free access. I mean, Morocco used to be part of something Macron did start a couple of years ago called the Mediterranean Union. It never worked out. Morocco is having constant trade deals with Europe. Products move into Morocco from Europe for free. Morocco says, oh, we're part of AFCTA. Nigeria, you have got a big market, boom. The consumers like exotic products. They love it. They want to just jump on it like that. They start to make a big boom in Nigeria almost for nothing. Balance of trade deficit is always a recurring decimal in all of this.
I mean, if Morocco...
all right, you'll answer this when we come back. We'll go to a quick break now. We'll talk some more.
Great to have you back here on the Morning Show. We still have with us Dr. Andrew Nevin, Partner and Chief Economist at PwC, talking about the implications of the AFCTA. I'll never get those acronyms right, but the agreement, yes.
So we're talking about countries like Morocco, how the pre-existing trade deal with the EU gets it in, move it across. And you know why I mentioned Morocco? Because Morocco had seen the viability and the potential in the ECOWAS market, and Morocco had begged to join ECOWAS at some point, and they were not allowed. So they have free access through the AFCTA now.
No, but
what happens?
What you just described is not viable. I mean, Morocco has to make a choice, right? So it can be in a free trade bloc with the EU, but then it can't be in a free trade bloc with AFC for exactly the reasons you cite, because you can't, the whole point of AFCFTA is to have a common set of rules to the outside. Now, I mean, Morocco may undergo that debate, and we could argue, look, if we're honest about the nature of Africa, there's a difference between sub-Saharan Africa and the Maghreb region, and maybe the Maghreb countries don't enter fully the AFCFTA. But what you described, you can't have one country, if you think about sort of Canada and NAFTA, we couldn't create then a Canada-EU agreement that allowed for that to come into Canada as a way to circumvent U.S. tariffs on that, right? So this will get worked out. I don't think Morocco will go as a rogue state.
What if they fight it out? What if they have a better case at dispute settlement body, and they go that route, and it works in their favor? I mean, these are the fears and concerns a lot of people have.
No, I get that, but you can't. But I don't think. I mean, this is not like one small dispute about one product or one company. I mean, the concept that Europe could have a free trade agreement with Morocco, and Morocco is part of AFCFTA, and you therefore could take European goods duty-free into Morocco as a way of avoiding, let's say we had 10% tariffs on European goods. That's not viable. That model just doesn't work. So Morocco needs to make a choice as this unfolds.
So they need to knock off the other pre-existing.
Yes, exactly.
So other overlapping trade agreements.
You cannot create a free trade bloc where someone is dumping that way.
Hang on a minute. How about countries we have bilateral trade agreement with? What happens? So automatically all of them are nullified?
Yes. That's the whole point of this.
So
is we
all
now,
of them
so
are
EU,
nullified?
Belgium does not have a trade agreement with Canada. Holland does not have a trade agreement with Singapore. The EU has these agreements.
Let's look at the common currency here. That's also important, right, to have this implemented. We don't still have one. ECHO 2020, isn't that rather optimistic?
Yeah, so I think we've said publicly at PwC that, look, we have other issues. We have AFCTA, and we have the integration across ECOWAS, which has not been entirely successful. So we don't understand why ECHO 2020 is still on the agenda, maybe ECHO 2030. What we would say, however, is what we think is more important in the short term is the ability for countries to trade in their own currencies with each other. So right now what happens is if we have Ivory Coast wants to trade with Nigeria, the Nigerian importer has to source USD to buy the Ivory Coast goods, which is expensive and cumbersome. Okay. Ivory Coast wants to import Nigerian goods. They have to source USD to do that, and that's highly inefficient. So what we would like to see is you can trade in your native currencies. Excuse me. Sorry. But of course, the Francophone countries already do because they have one currency on that. So it's relatively easy. I mean, not easy, totally frictionless. But the group that's working the hardest on this is Afro-Exim Bank. So they've been committed to intra-Africa trade for 3 or 4 years now, led by Ms. Kenayo. Fantastic initiative, huge progress. They're a big part of the whole, with the AU, of the AFCFTA. But what they're trying to create is a trading platform in West Africa where you can settle in your local currency. So effectively, you'd start to have central bank swaps. In the same way we have with China, you'd have it between Ivory Coast and Nigeria, between the CIFA countries and Ghana. That's where I think is the first step to this. I think the common currency is well down the line.
Let's also talk about the CFA countries. To a large extent, those currencies are not still hinged on the central banks in their country, still hinged away in France. So there's still a case of somebody pulling the strings from the West. There's still a case of colonialism there. Yes. And that's why it's difficult. So how do you reverse that? I mean, it would have been great if those CFA currencies were domiciled in African banks, but it's still domiciled in France.
Well, I am not going to defend the CIFA system. It makes really no sense. I mean, I don't have the historical context. It makes no sense to me that the Bank of France would control. I mean, the Bank of France doesn't even control the currency in France. Now they control the currency in I think 8 West African countries. So I would personally like to see this move on and that they control their own currency. And of course, but the fact that they've had a common currency has really helped them in economic integration. And what's very interesting is I was talking earlier about the stock market, securities market. They have an integrated securities market. So they've done a very good job of, on a smaller scale, but still large landmass, lots of people, of what AFCFTA wants to do globally. But I would like to see the CIFA control move back to Africa.
I mean, President Macron said recently he was going to look at that very strongly.
I hope so.
Should that be more of the advocacy of the African Union now, rather than talking about AFCTA, because AFCTA, we can't fully enjoy the gains of AFCTA if the control of the CIFA doesn't come back to the African continent.
But I mean, I'm sure the AU has a view on this, but the 8 Francophone West African countries, they're strong countries. They can stand up for themselves. They're organized together. I mean, I'm sure that there's a roadmap somewhere of how to disengage from the French central bank. And I think President Macron can see that historically it's no longer viable to do that. So hopefully in the next few years we'll see a change. But there are lots of advocates for it. So
one thing that comes to mind here is standardization of the products. I mean, this has taken about 17 years of tough negotiations among African countries. What are the dangers of complacency, for instance, for Nigeria when it comes to standardization of products?
Well, I think the thing with standardization is this is one area. What is the point of having 54 countries or even the ECOWAS countries that have different standards for products, whether it's medicines or food products, et cetera? So every time you create different standards, you create additional costs, additional barriers. So standardized, if you think about even more than tariffs, you can have a tariff, but what's really valuable is standardization. So we'd like to continue to see the drive for that. So the Standards Organization of Nigeria is a strong body. It's working hard to keep out substandard products here. But to the extent that we can get more standardization in Africa, or at least in the regional economic groupings of what a product is, it's enormously helpful. But it's so, I was talking to someone who was in the, like a African entrepreneur in the medical field, medical device. So they're trying to register same product, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania. They all have different standards for these medical devices. You would think the economic, human efficiency of having a similar standard is massive. So that's a big part of the AFCTA is can we get common standards?
As you're talking about standardization, I just want to explore in some questions I'll be asking now, the role of services. Because we're talking about all of this is about goods, services, and something very permanent is the question of intellectual property. How do we settle disputes on intellectual property? Because, I mean, there's a big wave of technology all over Africa as we speak today. So once you open up the borders, all over Africa, proprietary software, proprietary technology from Nigeria, somebody might see it in Kenya and say, oh, yeah, it's my software. AFCTA covers all of us. How do you nip this in the bud? Owing to the fact that in the regulations of the AU, we don't have a very robust intellectual property conversations in that law.
Yeah, I mean, this is intellectual property is an area I'm not familiar enough with. I think one of the challenges we're going to have, particularly in the West with the AFCFTA, of course, is we have English and we have French legal system. And it's hard for me to, they're so different. So for example, you talk about services. We don't have lawyers that work in Nigeria and Ivory Coast because they're completely different legal systems. And I've talked to a number of businessmen here who want to expand in West Africa, and they say, well, not only do we have the language issue, which to some extent they can overcome, but what they found the most challenging was a completely different legal system. So again, we go back to this being a 2063 project. I think it's going to be a very slow process. I mean, one of the most interesting things about Africa, of course, is Rwanda was a French colony, right? And had the French legal system. Belgian colony, sorry. And it made the decision to switch over to the English language. Now, I don't think and of course, they've hugely benefited in the last 20 years, their integration with Kenya, Uganda, and driving all of Africa integration. Now, I can't see the 8 Francophone West Africa countries switching to English, but it just shows you the benefits of getting common legal standards. So I do think this is going to be a big challenge for us, having the French and the English legal system just in the West.
How about for multinationals operating in Africa, like your multinational PwC, for instance, since it's open market, open transaction across board? It's not going to cause conflicts. It's going to cause, the term they constantly were using was overlapping. Isn't it going to cause some form of overlap?
Well, PwC is a network. So each national, the partners here own PwC Nigeria, the partners in Ghana own PwC Ghana. I mean, we do cooperate, but we already have frictions working in Africa. And the way we're organized is a little bit along the English Francophone lines too, so we're subject to that as well. So, it's not simple. But as I said, 50-year project. I mean, you think about, and people criticize the EU. Or not so much the EU, they criticize the euro these days and the problems, Greece and Italy. But I mean, the truth is, coming out of the Second World War, the creation of the EU was one of the most fantastic things for human prosperity and peace on this planet. I mean, it's been a hugely successful project. And you think about in recent years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, bringing in countries from Eastern Europe. I mean, when I've gone to visit some of the Czech Republic, for example. I mean, it's just a fantastic accomplishment. But again, it took 1,400 years, and then it's taken 50 years after the Second World War, 60 years now. I mean, this is a long-term project. I think the issue for Africans is just let's stay focused on this new Pan-Africanism and just take it step by step by step. I don't think people should be jumping ahead too many steps. This is just, we're going to do a better job in Africa if we just stay the course. And all of the issues you raised, rules of origin, dumping, intellectual property, mismatched legal systems, they all exist. But we can work through it if we just do infrastructure, like transnational infrastructure, if we just work through it step by step. But we're not rushing.
Step by step. What I hear you say is that there are more advantages than disadvantages to the AFCFTA. I got it this time around. Okay, great. We'll go on a quick break, but when we come back, I want us to talk about the benefits for the individuals. I'm being told by our producers that we have to let you go. Dr. Nevin, thank you so much for being here
always
on
a pleasure.
the show.
Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to have you.